Welcome, everybody. Good to see everybody here.
I am so excited to be doing this webinar with you, LaTonya. This should be
Yeah.
really, really fun. I've been digging into your book, and I've got a lot of questions for you. So, LaTonya, pardon me for reading this. I know that's a little bit rude, but I want to make sure I get all of this. So, founder of the Change Coaches, LaTonya partners with executives, professionals, teams to build cultures through highly customized coaching and consulting services. She's sought after keynote speaker, inspired audiences all over the world. I know her as a hone coach. I've watched some of her classes. They are amazing. She built her career working in HR, talent management, and learning development at Fortune 500 companies before teaching and taking on progressive leadership roles at University of Illinois, Guy's College of Business. LaTonya was featured on the peer-nominated list of most inclusive HR influencers in 2019. And she is the author of this lovely book, Leading Below the Surface. And it's available in Amazon in both Kindle and hardcover. So our poll was, do you bring your whole self to work? So I think that's a really good place to start. 38% of you said yes, 8% said no, and 54% sometime. And I just wanted to share this comic as we kind of start talking about psychological safety is how norms and how company cultures try to make you fit in, and maybe that doesn't really kind of mesh with who you are, and it makes you feel like you can't bring yourself to work. So with that, LaTonya, can you oh, I think my screen is paused. I'm going to resume sharing. So yeah, with that, LaTonya, can you tell us a little bit about what it means to bring your whole self to work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. But before I jump in, I want to thank everybody for coming. Matt did his assignment, so he's going to ask me some deep questions. And so what does it mean to fit in at work? Is that what you asked me? I think so. And
or bring your whole self to work. So you talk about this a lot in the book with a lot of your story.
It's a really hard thing for me to talk about because I would say that I wasn't able to do that myself until maybe about 5 years ago or so. And what that means is you come to work, you feel safe around who you are. You feel safe around how people are going to treat you. You are not afraid about, covering up things in your life. And it's just really hard to achieve, especially if you're someone who is from historically othered groups, to bring your entire self to work, because you might have, cultural differences, hobby differences, all those types of things. You might not be able to relate as well, but that's what it means. It means that you can go to work every single day and you're feeling excited. You're feeling like there's really not a lot that's off limits, especially when it comes to you and how you contribute.
Got it. And so as you're writing this book, could you tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book and why you wrote it now?
Yeah. So I get asked this question a lot, and it's actually a very deep and emotional topic for me because as Matt, when you introduced me, you talked about my career before I kind of went out on my own. And I worked in a lot of different, larger companies that had entire DEI departments, and that never worked for me. Diversity, equity, inclusion never worked. And no matter how big the department was, how senior the most senior leader was, it never worked for me. Meanwhile, in my life, I had a very amazing inspiration throughout my life, who was my grandma, Ruthie, and I talk about her in my dedication. And one of the things I always saw her model is that she was really good with building real relationships with people who are different from her. And this was something she always did well. She was always a light. And she was so much of a light that at her funeral, I have a story about that. There was a woman that I'd never met before, and I learned that she was one of the granddaughters of her coworkers. And she told me that my grandmother had adopted her and became her mother when her mother died. And so my grandma was just really good at this, just with people who are different from her. She worked in a school cafeteria, and every student loved her, even students that were different from her. And I got really frustrated with DEI because it didn't work in this way. It didn't help us build real relationships with people who are different from us. It was full of, dashboards. It was full of training, like all these things that didn't really make a difference. And I couldn't feel at the level that I was at. And so I thought about this book for a long time. I had some below the surface leaders. I didn't know what to call them. People would call them good people. I'm like, that's not enough. That's not sufficient. And so about maybe 3 years ago, I'm like, I'm going to write this. And then COVID, like the pandemic hit. And then then I said, okay, I'm really going to do this because my grandma had passed away and I was feeling really inspired. And I knew that I could write this book really well. And so that's because of the unique perspective that I have. And so that's when I went for it. And that's why I wrote it. I wrote it so I could create real change in the workplace. And so we could really think about how we treat each other first. And in the book, I call those the hows. We're always looking at the what's, and the what's are like the revenue. That's like, what we produce, the widgets, but how we treat each other.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked about your book, I love that story, but also a lot of the stories that you relate are, I almost wanted to check your LinkedIn to make sure we didn't work at the same place, because a lot of that felt really familiar to me, how kind of workplaces tend to operate. And one of the things I really wanted to ask you, and it's sort of been thinking about is, um, a lot of the core leadership values that companies love to kind of, call their culture. It's about speed, meritocracy, decisiveness, being high energy, being relentless, um, and how those things can actually be detrimental to
Mhm.
building an inclusive workplace. Could you talk a little bit about that? I never thought
Yeah.
about it in those terms.
Yeah. So you said speed, meritocracy, decisive, high energy, relentlessness. Who identifies with that? If you identify with those values and those are your values, type yes in chat. And if you don't, then type no in chat. Um, Nobody identifies with these values. I don't know who made these up. So basically, what happens with corporate values a lot of the times is that these values are created basically in isolation with just a few people in a room. For values to work towards a culture of belonging, they need to be shared, right? And we always leave that out. And these values are, I will tell you, they're usually not shared by your employees. Also, these values are very competitive, right? We're trying to, a lot of organizations are trying to talk about building cultures of belonging, building inclusive cultures, building cultures where people want to work. I mean, we are in a great resignation right now. So you want to build a culture where people want to work. And that's not it. That's not it. These values are not it. And again, they are values that what I call in my book, I talk about a concept called KPEs, and it's knowledge, perspectives, and experiences. And I talk about the dominant leadership standard. And the reason why we have this dominant leadership standard written mostly by men with values like this is because we have limited KPEs. And so I will tell you, a lot of those companies that have these values, they're written, again, this is the dominant leadership standard, and they're written by very few people, and they're really detrimental to the organization. So I'll start off with that answer because I want to give you an opportunity to ask more questions, but don't get me started on meritocracies because that's like the worst value any organization can ever have. And I talk about that quite a lot in my book.
Well, I do want to dig in just because I think it's so interesting, because the meritocracy point, I mean, I remember I went to business school and we would talk about Jack and GE and how you cut off the bottom 10%. And in a way, you almost imagine it as being a fair thing, right? Like everybody is able to kind of pull themselves up and go accomplish these things. But in the book, you talk about how that's not really always the case.
No, I mean, there's a couple of things. One is equity. And so if you have a meritocracy, first of all, you're assuming that everyone has equitable access to the tools that they need to navigate their career successfully. And we know that's not true. For example, if you are saying you have a meritocracy, then and that's how people succeed, you're also saying that everyone has equitable access to leaders if they need it in order to succeed in their careers. We know that's not true. I also talk about I cite a study in my book by Emilio Castillo, who is a researcher at MIT, and he did a study with a large company on meritocracies. And what he found is, although this company basically bragged about being a meritocracy, when you actually dug a little bit deeper, BIPOC employees, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and immigrant employees, people that were non-US based, they, even though they got similar or better performance scores than some of their white peers, they received lower raises, right? So let me repeat that. Even though they got higher or the same performance scores as their white counterparts, they received lower bonuses and wages. What does that tell you? Meritocracy does not work, right? Again, there's so many biases that run some of these talent processes. And I talk a lot about that in the book, that it just doesn't work. There's no such thing as a meritocracy.
So some of the best stories, I think, are about some of the leaders you encountered along your personal journey. And the notion that, leaders shouldn't be necessarily encouraging competition among the people that they're managing, really resonated. But you use, and it's the title of your book, Leading Below the Surface. Can you kind of tell us what that means? Like, what is surface level and what is leading below the surface, and what makes a leader one or the other?
Yeah. So in my book, I talk, again, I was thinking about what I was going to call this, because throughout my life, I had different types of leaders. I had my first below the surface leader, and I'll give you that example, and then I'll talk about my first surface level leader. So below the surface leader, it was 9/11. And I was working for a company that was a services company, and my assignment was on site at one of their clients, and they were already not doing well. So I was basically just scraping by with the job. And I remember standing in that break room and seeing the planes crash into the towers. And I knew I wasn't going to have a job. I just knew, because I was just barely hanging on by a string. And I was right. And what happened is this was the first below the surface leader I could remember that I had. My boss drove about 30 miles to come see me in person to kind of have a discussion about the fate of my role. And basically what it was is that I was going to lose my position. I could take a lower level position if I wanted. And that's pretty much all she could offer me. The way that she did it was below the surface, in that she came into my office, she practiced empathy right away, she listened, she sat in a position that, in a less powerful position than me, where she came to my office and didn't make me go to a neutral space. She let me sit in the most powerful position in the room. And she basically just really empathized with me and kind of talked about her own fears around 9/11 and the future of the company. And so that was the first below the surface leader I had. What did she do? Well, the conversation was very psychologically safe. Like, I felt like I could say anything and there wouldn't be any repercussions. She was an empathetic listener. She was practicing both kinds of listening I talk about in the book. One is person to belonging listening. So she was kind of being able to observe everything that I was doing, how I was fitting into the conversation, how I was engaging in the conversation. And then she practiced real leadership, which I'll talk about a little bit later, which is relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal. And she was doing all those things in our conversation. Surface leaders, my gosh, there's so many out there, and I've had so many in my life. And the one I remember the most, because it was the most devastating experience, and I talk about this in my book. I lost my sister at a pretty young age, in adulthood. So I wasn't a child. I was in early adulthood. She was my only sister, and she passed away when I was early in my career, right? And I was trying to do a really good job. And so what happened is, one of those surface leaders, that, as I call them, basically, I was doing really well in this company, doing great. I'd gotten like the highest raises I was considered, one of the top in my department. And what happened is that my boss started telling me that my performance was declining because my sister had passed away. And I was trying to tell her, hey, this is really hard. And she's like, well, you have 2 weeks of vacation. So, I mean, you could take that vacation. And that right there is a surface leader, where there is stick to business, get this done, work fast, work hard. There are no breaks. There is no empathy. There's no room for, life and life happening. And those are surface leaders. Transitional leaders are kind of in between. Usually those are surface leaders that have some awareness and they're trying to get a little bit more below the surface. But yeah, that's a surface leader. And unfortunately, too many of us have had this happen to us with surface leaders.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about surface leaders, it almost feels like that's sort of our shared work culture in America, is that you get the job done at all costs. It's about the work, and you're sick and you should still be working. Yeah, that's really interesting. But something that you said too, as you were talking about below the surface leaders, and something you repeat throughout the book, is the idea that the practice of becoming a below the surface leader, the ideas that you have to commit to aren't that hard necessarily. It's the commitment that you make to those ideals. And you talk a lot about empathy too, about, when in doubt, practice empathy almost. Can you talk about how, leadership should be thinking about tapping into empathy and what that really means?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I use the word access a lot because I think all of us are capable of empathy. We just have to access it. And it's hard for some of us to access it, especially if we're trapped in surface environments. If you're trapped in surface environments, you're probably not going to access empathy a lot because your colleagues aren't, and your organization isn't really kind of fostering that environment to access empathy. Some easy ways to kind of start, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is one is listening. And you can really, even if you start here and this is all you do after this webinar, try to listen better. And what I mean by that is you practice what I call person-to-person listening. And when, for example, Matt's saying something to me, I'm playing back what he's saying. There's so many times when, and even all of us do it, right? We ask someone a question. And I want everybody to think about the last time this happened to you. You ask someone a question and they answer the question and you're spacing out, doing something else, checking your phone. So instead of doing that, I want you to practice playing back in your head what that person's saying to you. For me, I write it down, right? I write down like some of the highlights of what I'm saying and some prompts so I could play that back to the person. Try to match their energy. So another way you can practice person-to-person listening is when, if Matt comes to me and Matt's feeling stressed out about something, I can match that energy and say, oh yeah, Matt, you're feeling really stressed. And I can access that level of empathy for him. One thing that in empathy don't is trying to fix something. Like, Matt comes to me and I'm like, and he comes to me stressed and I'm like, oh my gosh, I gotta do something. I gotta fix that. But it's really trying to access where the other person is. And I think that's the easiest way to access empathy is to start with listening. I also have something sometimes I do with executives, and I have them do empathy interviews with their employees. And what that means is asking vulnerable questions of employees, again, and responding with active listening and not trying to fix it and just meandering in the muck. And I talk about that a lot, where we're meandering in the human muck of what's going on in our employees. Again, instead of trying to move on, trying to fix it, trying to evade what their feelings are and their experiences are in the workplace.
Yeah. Wow. So I have a young daughter, and it just sort of reminds me of something that I do with her that I've never really thought about in a work environment. So there's another book, Happiest Toddler on the Block. And one of the things you're supposed to do with young children, is you try to match their energy so that they feel heard. So if she
Oh,
wants a toy and she's crying about it, you're not, it's not matter of fact. It's, you wanted that toy. You feel
yeah.
bad, don't you? You really wanted that toy. Well, here's how, and you try to sort of match how they're feeling so that they can feel that too. But
Mhm,
I've never really, I've been a manager for a long time. I never really thought about matching that in an empathetic way, just in conversation.
mhm. Yeah, it's a different way of thinking, right? Because a lot of times, as humans, we want to make people feel better, or we want to fix it, or we want to tell people, "Hey, you shouldn't feel that way. This is how you should feel. This is what really happened." And it's really just practicing not doing anything except listening and reflecting and playing it back.
Yeah. And the idea of, I think you used, is it miring in the muck? It's sort of
Yeah.
staying present through things that are
Hmm.
unpleasant, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that's kind of hard to do because you almost don't want to do that when you're talking to somebody. It's like you kind of want to move to happy, and
Hmm.
maybe that's not the way to go.
Yeah, it's so I call it meandering in the muck, and one of the things where I see this a lot, and I challenge executives to do this is in listening sessions. So a lot of times I'll run listening sessions with companies, and I will actually have executives sit there and listen to the experiences of their Black employees, the raw experiences of their Black employees, or the other employees of color, or even employees that, like, I did some listening sessions the other day, and employees were upset because they were being forced to come into the office. And 90% of the time, their executives are like, "Oh my gosh, now that we had these sessions, I'm going to go talk to John and I'm going to straighten that out." No, I mean, you have to meander in the muck, and you're going to feel really uncomfortable meandering in John's muck when John is talking about, all these times where he might have experienced racism, and there's absolutely nothing you can do except listen and empathize. That is hard to do, and that's what I mean by meandering in the muck. And I talk about the Kubler-Ross change curve, because in that bottle it talks about, you have to get in the pit first before you can come back out of it. And if you don't go in the pit first, then you're going to try to cut corners, and that's not going to create real change.
Yeah, or maybe the person doesn't even feel heard, right? If you're trying to
Mhm.
just move on to the next thing. Um, so you mentioned person-to-person listening, but I think in the book you also talk about a different kind of listening, which is a new thing to me as well. Can you talk about that? It's sort of listening to how somebody fits into their environment, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's another type of listening I call person to belonging listening. And what that is it's like, I want all of you to kind of imagine that you're in a room with your team, like whether you work on a team in a company or whether you work on a team as an entrepreneur or whatever. I want you to think about a time when, like, I want you to imagine that you're with your team. And I want you to imagine that instead of talking in that meeting or directing that meeting, you're just observing people, right? You're observing people, and you're observing the extent to which they belong in the team. You're observing the extent to which they get an opportunity to talk. You're observing the extent to which people validate them. You're observing the extent to which people defer to them. That's person to belonging listening. And that tells you a lot about a person and how well they belong to an environment. But the issue is that we don't step back and do that too much, because what we're usually doing is we think as leaders, we're supposed to lead the meeting, right? We're supposed to run the meeting. We're supposed to keep it on time. But, we're stepping back and letting your team run it, and you observe is so much more powerful, right? Because then you can observe the team dynamics. You can observe if someone's dominating. You can observe, who's got like the most clout on the team, if people are feeling psychologically safe, all those things. And so that's what person to belonging listening is. And so I challenge all of you to try to tap into that, to listen more and observe your team rather than just trying to lead the meetings.
Yeah. And so um, one of the things that I think, so we've been talking a lot about how sort of individuals, especially managers, are surface level or below the surface, but can you talk a little bit about how organizations or even how cultures can be that way? Like a culture can be, you know, just like a manager could be very surface level,
Mhm.
a company culture could be surface
Mhm.
level.
Yeah, it's everywhere. And I recently wrote about this in an article in Fast Company where, and it's all about how do you interview for a job and get below the surface in a company that, or how do you know that the company is surface? So chapter 5 is called Navigating a Surface World. And this was probably one of my favorite chapters to write because we live in a world that's surface. I mean, unfortunately, where one of the stats that I heard early in my career, it was repeated over and over, was okay, you have 5 seconds to show someone that, or to prove your worth, and if you don't prove your worth in 5 seconds and make a first impression in 5 seconds, forget it. How much more surface can you get, right? Like, you're going to give me 5 seconds to make a first impression. What does that even mean? Right. And so a lot of organizations are built on this, right? Where it is very surface, and there's an in group and there's an out group, and there's like a way that there's a prototype, there's a way that you look, and it's very surface, it's very up here. And it's like all those words that you describe, or that you said earlier, Matt, that those words describe a surface culture, right? Speed, meritocracy, relentlessness. That's that prototype up here. And so it happens all the time. I mean, a lot of surface cultures, one of the things I talk about a lot with these is that they have like what they call like great cultures or cultures of fun. And it's very surface, like surface level things are supposed to make you happy, like a happy hour. I mean, come on. Like, there are so many other ways to hang out with your peers than to drink, copious amounts of alcohol, right? So yeah, so that's what a surface culture is. And again, if you have a bunch of surface leaders, you're going to be trapped in a surface culture.
Oh, it reminded me of a specific story from your book where um, I think you're interviewing at a company and they showed you their fun room. It was like here's
It
the
was
fun
empty.
room,
Yeah,
and it was
yeah,
empty.
yeah.
I've worked at places where we've had like video games and stuff, and nobody's using them. But that's like, I think that's what you mean, right? Like,
Mhm.
here's this thing. It should be fun, but there's no depth to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, don't give me video games. Give me a couple of wellness weeks off. I was just hearing some of my folks at Spotify, they had a wellness week. It's like, would you rather have that or video games that no one's playing? I mean, what are
Yeah.
so again, that's very surface, right? Where you can brag about that and think that people are going to come work for you. It's like that shiny object that you want to show people, that first impression after 5 seconds, right?
Yeah, I used to work for a video game company a long time ago, and they had consoles and every video game you could imagine because they reviewed video games. But there was one area that was set up, and it was right in front of the CEO's sort of fishbowl with glass panes. And the first thing they said was, never use that one. Don't ever use that one.
Yeah.
Because again, like, you would be judged almost immediately. It probably wouldn't
Wow.
matter what your output
Yeah.
was.
Right.
That's what they would see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what about a below the surface culture? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there are three prongs to below the surface leadership and cultures. The first, like I said, is real leadership: relatable, equitable, aware, and loyal. The one thing I want to talk about with that acronym are loyal leaders, and loyal leaders are they pose the opposite of the surface leader that I just talked about when my sister passed away. A loyal leader would have been loyal with me through the process and known, hey, LaTonya just experienced something very traumatic, something very rare for someone at her age. So I'm going to be loyal to her and be understanding to her and kind of help her get through this period of her life, right? That would be the opposite of what happened. And that's below the surface. What's interesting is in that company, some people were afforded that privilege, but I was not, right, with the loyalty. So that's the first thing, is there's equity in that privilege to be able to experience that loyalty in a company. The second prong is empathetic leadership and listening. And so if you're in a below the surface culture, you feel like people are empathetic, right? Like you feel like when you talk, people listen. Again, you feel like they're matching your emotions where you're at. You feel like they're kind of observing if you're fitting in or not. I tell a story about a below the surface leader in my past who actually was observing when I was at a party, and he knew never to throw a crazy party like that for me ever again. That was not a way to reward me, right? And so that, again, that's how you know. And the third one is psychological safety. I can't say enough about that. Amy Edmondson wrote my foreword, and so that's another reason why I can't say enough. I knew I wanted her to be involved since the beginning. And psychological safety is, when you can make a mistake, or when you could bring your whole self to work and you're not experiencing repercussions. And you know that because, again, you can make a mistake, or something can fall off, or you can speak up, or you cannot impress someone in 5 seconds, and you're not going to be derailed instantly. So that's what a below the surface culture looks like. And it's a culture that you want to go and you want to work in every day. And like, it's a culture where you actually feel human. You feel like people. You feel like people can bring things up, like no one's scared. And so it's a very unique thing. And if you have worked in a below the surface culture, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. It's probably is a rare experience. Maybe if you have experienced it, maybe you've only experienced one or two or so. And it looks like you have a poll, so you're one step ahead of me, Matt.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I put up the poll because I wanted to kind of get a sense.
Yeah.
Anybody who hasn't taken the poll, please put your answers in, because I'm going to use this for the next question I have for LaTonya. So I'll give that 1 second, and I'm going to end it right now. So actually, this feels a bit more positive than I think I would have imagined. But I think there's also, and something that you address too, is the notion that, one, even a below the surface culture isn't below the surface all the time. And maybe you are working in a team that's below the surface, but your culture is a little bit more surface level. And so one of the things I wanted to maybe touch on was that the notion that you as an individual could do something, even if maybe your culture was celebrated surface level things, and maybe you want to go a bit deeper. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I talk about different tracks in my book because I got sick of reading all these books, and it was like, go big or go home. And I was like, wait, I don't have the power to do any of this stuff. So I talk about different tracks. I talk about an individual track, and that's focusing on doing things within your team, maybe even with specific people. And on the individual track, as Matt said, a lot of us, we equate our organizational culture to our team culture. So you can create, take those 3 prongs of what I said with below the surface leadership, psychological safety, empathetic leadership, and real leadership. And you could kind of develop that within your team. And even if your team is, whether your team is 10 people or 5 people, you can start with your team level. The second track is, doing something like in a department level. And the way that you could do that is like, if in your unit, let's say that you are like a designer and you work on a small designer team, but maybe that whole department of designers, once you start getting some things going on your team, you can kind of take that up to the department level and start, advising some of those managers also to come around. The third way is, like, I always call it the go big or go home approach, because that's the approach that I always ran into. And that's if you have power in your organization, you can make a lot of change. And again, I think when Matt mentioned, when in doubt, be empathetic. You could start there, right? Just start with, introducing what that is to your managers, and ask them to practice empathy with their teams. Also, psychological safety, create that, talk about that with your managers, make that an expectation to practice that with their team. So there's 3 different tracks there that I mentioned.
Yeah. With that, I want to go into some of the questions because some of the
Mhm.
questions
Yeah,
that
sure.
I see are directly tied to this particular point. So this one from Tim. By the way, everybody who's listening right now, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A so we can get to them. We're going to just move it right into some of the Q&A stuff now. So this question comes from Tim. It sounds like I'll just read his question. Can you address how to implement significant cultural change in an organization that's historically 30 plus years been more hierarchical with a focus on
Mm.
surface issues, but where staff, through a very detailed inclusion survey, said they did not feel they have a voice or a part in decision making or a true sense of belonging?
Yeah. So the way that I would say to start there would, if I were working with this group, I would probably start with team coaching at the executive level. It sounds like there were some surveys and people were hearing that there need to be some changes, but now the executive team is probably like, what do I do? And um, at that point, again, it starts to get executives. Again, a lot of executives operate like with the speed and decisiveness and all that because they have to, because there's shareholders. So there's probably going to be some sort of rollout of initiatives. But before you do that, it's like I said, kind of meandering in the muck and hearing a little bit more about what your employees are experiencing what they're experiencing. And so starting with that, I'd probably also ask the executive team to do some empathy interviews with employees and take it one step further than a survey, because a survey, you can kind of hide behind a computer and you can hide behind spreadsheets, but really kind of conditioning them to be able to be at a different level with their employees, to be more real with their employees. And so that is really where it starts, is there. From that point on, they could coach their teams to also change the culture on that level and create a little bit more psychological safety there. So again, I think from there, it would, especially if it's been 30 years, you're not going to see much change unless this team kind of looks inward and kind of embodies the path forward.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you said earlier too about sort of this, the path of go big or go home, but there's also so many things that maybe you as a manager can start to implement
Mhm.
inside of your teams. Okay, so I have another question. This one's for employees who are early in their careers. This one's from Costas. He says, what advice do you have for employees who are early in their careers and don't feel confident enough to take initiatives and speak up? What are some of the steps that employers and management can take to make them feel more empowered?
Mhm. Hey, Costas, how are you? I haven't seen that name in a while, so I think it's the Costas I'm thinking it is. Um, so I think your question is, if someone's a little bit more introverted or quiet, how can organizations help them speak up? Um, well, my first pushback would be like, do they have to speak up? And what does that have to look like? Um, so again, I would ask that manager, or if you're the manager that's thinking about this, practice person to belonging listening, right? Where you can kind of observe the person that feels quiet, or you might perceive to be quiet, and see like how they communicate, like maybe see how they successfully communicate and what that looks like. But just observe and try not to. It's hard to build a true culture of belonging if you're trying to make people fit into a box and be extroverted or be that loudest voice. But so if you really can listen to them and kind of discern like what helps them to speak up, or even what helps them assert themselves, and it might just be in a different way. I mean, you might have to just give them the floor. Like I had an employee once where I had to give them the floor. I had to be like, hey, what do you think? Like every single time. And I had to make it quiet. So I had to level, again, that's equity. That's creating equity on your team. So people that are quieter, you're giving them a chance to speak up too. Another thing is that maybe it's not them speaking up verbally. Maybe they want to communicate via email or via other means. But again, providing that opportunity for them to express themselves in the way that they feel comfortable. The last thing I'll add here is, if you have employees that you feel are quiet or not asserting themselves, I want all of you to kind of go back and check your team culture. Is it rewarding some of those things that Matt talked about earlier? Is it rewarding the highest voice or the loudest voice? Is it rewarding the quickest voice? Is it rewarding the most dominant person? And think about that, because again, you have many different styles on the team. And if you're looking to change your team culture, that starts with you.
Great. And then I have a few more questions I really want to get through, because this one's interesting. So this one's from Barrett. So he's in a small company. Wellness Week just doesn't work really financially. But he wants to keep employees engaged, and he wants to give them some of those benefits, activities. How do you maximize for kind of below the surface activities, even if you're on a budget?
Yeah, I think just some of the things that I talked about, like with the game rooms and with the weekly happy hours, that's way more expensive than your managers just sitting down with employees and getting to know them and getting to know what they want and what they need, right? Like sometimes I think we overthink this, right? Where again, we're trying to have like something like one thing works for most, right? Where, okay, if most people are going to want to bring their dog to work, most people are going to want to wear jeans to work, whatever. But a lot of times, again, you're making a lot of assumptions here. So there are little things you can do. And some examples on teams I had is like, you don't have to give them a wellness week. You can give them a wellness day and have everybody take it off on different days, right? You can give people development days, like where they can go off and do some development for themselves. You can kind of ask people what they want, or you can kind of observe employees and hear what they like to do and hear what makes them tick, and like do something around that. Like maybe some of your employees like nature hikes, and you can arrange a nature hike together, right? And leave the office, a half day early and do that. So there's all these examples. And again, I think sometimes we think if we don't have a big budget, then that equals inferiority, but it's kind of the opposite, right? I think again, that stuff is more expensive when you're trying to buy your employees' happiness than when you're trying to, make their happiness with them.
Yeah, I think it's a different kind of happiness too, right? Just more fulfilling. So this one comes from anonymous attendee. They didn't put their name, but you mentioned earlier that some of the DEI programs you've been exposed to, weren't really working. He asks, what are some things you've observed or experienced from company DEI programs that are surface level or not effective or didn't work for you?
Yeah, so in some of my roles, I worked in learning and development. So I have to admit that I was complicit in some of this stuff too. And so, but some of those things that I mentioned that were surface training, especially mandatory training, if you look at the research, it does not work. Okay, so mandatory training doesn't work, causes a lot of issues, right? I'm not saying we don't need mandatory compliance training, great. But having mandatory training about how we treat each other is not going to, that's not going to move the needle at all. So I would say that training, I would say quotas or dashboards. Again, yeah, do we need to have goals? Yes. But again, if you're going to have hiring goals around like the number of people that you bring in that are different, before you do that, you first have to think about or consider if you have the environment that these people even want to work in, right? And so what was happening, again, surface level, these companies would meet those hiring goals and they would brag about these hiring goals, but those same people were gone within 2 years, right? Because they just didn't fit into the culture, right? So I mean, that's another one. I think another one is, just kind of bragging again about, the number of people that you have at different levels. Again, it doesn't tell the full story. Are those people happy? Are they not? When I personally, and I know you didn't ask this, but I want to kind of give you the opposite view. Like, how do I know when a company is really below the surface, especially when it comes to DEI? I know when they're not bragging about these things, when I could go to their website and I could see exactly where they are. And when I ask them about it, they're humble and they say, oh yeah, you're right. Our leadership team is all white. And you're exactly right. And this is where we're going with this. And these are some of the actions that we're taking right now. And when they describe those actions, I listen in if they're below the surface actions. Again, if they're like, okay, we're going to do training, or we hired a chief diversity officer, big deal. So what? So that's the kind of stuff that you're looking for if you're looking for a below the surface culture, especially that cares about DEI. But again, those are the things that you look for, and those are the things that you don't look for.
Barrett's putting in some awesome ideas too for low budget or
Thank you.
Low budget, but awesome ideas. She's got some good ideas there in the chat. Now, there was another question here. Let's see if I can find it. But I think the idea was, oh, here, it's from JD. For leadership reviews expectations, you have a recommendation to measure psychological safety, or how do you know if there's growth in that area? I guess, how do you know if you are building a below the surface culture?
I mean, I think the best way to do that, or I hate the word best, but some good ways to do that would be survey data, have multiple questions about psychological safety, measure it year over year. I think the second way, which isn't as scalable as the surveys, would be annual listening sessions, not focus groups, listening sessions around psychological safety, how it's happening in the teams, if it's happening in the teams, to what level. Some of that stuff you can only get to if you're listening and doing these listening sessions, because when you're doing listening sessions, a lot of times people, when they're filling out a survey, they don't really understand truly what psychological safety is. They think they know, but they know the definition, but they don't know what the experience actually feels like. But if you're doing listening sessions, you can actually ask that question, right? You can get to that question and you can access, again, that empathy around that, so that employee is able to give you as many details as possible. But there's two ways, again, and again, those listening sessions are not focus groups. And please, other people share if you like. I love how everybody's sharing ideas in the chat. Definitely, if you have other ideas of like low budget ways to promote retention and belonging, please put that in there. And also, if you have other ways that you've measured psychological safety, I think the number one way these days, again, are surveys. That's the most scalable, but listening sessions are another way.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I think if we don't get to your question, hopefully I'll follow up with you, LaTonya, and maybe we can answer those one-on-one. But Barrett just put in a really interesting question. I really want to get your answer to this. So how do you get below the surface effect if the team's remote? And so she's saying, we're struggling a bit with that. We don't have a daily view in the team. Now they're doing via usual cues like body language or office drop-ins. So we're all working remote now. How do you get below the surface when you're working remotely?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things I want you to consider with this question. So I think that a lot of companies, when they went remote, they basically weren't really remote. They were just working from home. So they were keeping all the same practices in place, except they were working from home. And that was a disaster for many companies because they basically lost their grip on their culture, right? And so what I would challenge in that situation is for you to visualize all the, like what a workday would look like if you were in the office, right? What would a workday look like if you were in the office? So many of you are probably thinking about this. And when I'm thinking about what my workday would look like if I am in the office, I mean, I also work pretty much like 90% remotely. I would go in, I would probably have a stand up with my team. I would go in my office, do some work. I'd probably go to some meetings. Middle of the day, I'd probably have lunch with a colleague. And then, I'd probably sit in a public space for a little while, do some work and do that work collaboratively. So all those activities, doing the work collaboratively, having lunch with a colleague, doing a daily stand-up, all that stuff can be done remotely, right? All of it. And it could be done via Zoom. It could be done via Slack. It could be done in many different areas. And so create that, right? I think we have to create that. I know there's a lot of backlash with people getting exhausted with having their cameras on all day. And I don't think your camera should be on all day for Zoom, but I do think that there should be some meetings where your cameras are on. And I always ask people to have their cameras on with me when I'm coaching them, because I have to see your face and I have to see your body language. And otherwise, I'm just not going to be a good coach. So I think you have to pick the meetings where you want to see people's faces and you want to kind of practice some of that P2B listening. But also kind of think about, again, go through your day and what would that look like in the office, and create that, right? We can all create that, especially if you're going to be working remotely, basically for the foreseeable future or even forever. You have to create those opportunities to interact with each other on both at formal and informal basis. Otherwise, it's just going to be you in meetings all day and doing your work all day. And that's not a way to build a culture of belonging.
Fantastic. LaTonya, I think we are at time. So I'm going to do two things. I want to drop a couple links into the chat for everybody. So the first is a link to go buy your book. So buy LaTonya's book. It's an amazing book. But since you're here today, fill out this type form and we will send you a copy of her book. It's really awesome. And I'd like to invite everybody to check out Hone too. So just go to honehq.com. LaTonya leads some of our classes. Again, amazing facilitator. This has been an awesome discussion. So thank you, everybody. If you have trouble with those links, you can also send me a personal email. My email is matt@honehq.com. If you forget, it's also team@honehq.com and all those things at the moment. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, LaTonya. This is such an awesome chat. And I really am hoping everybody gets a chance to read your book.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and everyone, keep leading below the surface. We can all do this, and let's support each other while we're doing it.
Thank you. All right, go fill out the survey, everybody, and bye-bye. Thanks.